Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I've got 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Today's topic is ergonomics for forklift operators. Sometimes I feel like this is a group that gets forgotten in the process of ergonomics, probably because their workstation, quote unquote, has some limitations, obviously, and we don't often think of someone who sits all day and doesn't work at the computer anyways, who sits all day, has a huge number of concerns from an ergonomic perspective, and perhaps they aren't your heaviest hitters or the ones you're most concerned about at your workstation, but they are an area or a group that you may want to be considering as part of the process. So, okay, sounds like everybody's, oh, sorry, just double checking. Everybody looks like they can hear me okay. Awesome. So that's really the goal of today, is to talk about what ergonomics for your forklift operators might look like. Specifically, I want to go through a few things. We're going to talk about what are the hazards for forklift operators, what do they, they're typically exposed to, because they have some specific hazards that speak to the type of work that they do. And then we're going to talk about some basic strategies for addressing these hazards. We've been doing some work with a couple clients just, well, 2 or 3 different times over the last few months now, doing some training and we've been developing some best practices and some strategies on how you address this with most effectively anyways with this group. So we're going to share some of that information with you as well, and talk to you about the purchasing component, because that's obviously is where your biggest opportunity lies, is making sure that the equipment that you're getting, not only does it do the job that it needs to do, but it also speaks to the ergonomic component that your staff would ultimately be able to benefit from. So we're going to talk about all of those things today. So one of the questions you're probably going to hear, or you would hear if you started asking your forklift operators, is how does ergonomics apply to me? It's like I said, it's a common area that we would struggle to apply the term ergonomics to, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist. And certainly they have hazards that are associated with musculoskeletal disorders that we need to talk about. And then we, essentially, if you're talking about training, which we will be here in a few minutes, we need to be able to take this concept and apply this question or answer this question for this group. They need to understand how ergonomics does apply to them. Just as importantly to that is, how does ergonomics help them? So how does the ergonomics of the equipment setup, how does the ergonomics of the features that you've provided in your forklifts, how do these things speak to their ergonomics and their ability to position themselves properly while in their piece of equipment, reducing injury risk? So you need to sort of tackle this on both ends. I did this the most recent training. I actually just did it about a week and a half ago, and one of the staff stopped me after I had just gotten started with the training, and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't actually know what the term ergonomics means." And I thought, of course, it's silly of me not to have started with that, number one, but it was sort of telling, right? That no one, this person wasn't brand new to this job. No one had ever applied the word ergonomics to anything that he had done. And so he didn't know what the term what the term meant, and didn't understand, obviously, if you don't know what it means, you can't understand how it applies to you or what the opportunities are associated with that. So it's interesting or telling to me that he really didn't know what that term meant, A, from a workplace perspective, but B, I think forklift operators don't always see this connection well. They may see how ergonomics applies to the office staff. Almost everybody can talk about that. They may even see how it applies to other folks in your facility who are doing more manual handling type work, but they may not struggle to see how it applies to them. So that's the goal of this training, really, is to make sure they understand it, and then make sure they know how to apply some of the concepts to their work every day. Specifically, we're looking at a forklift operator. I mean, I think we all know that the basic job description is they operate some sort of powered forklift, and there are all kinds of different ones out there for different purposes. It doesn't really matter what type of forklift that they operate. There are the basic principles essentially are the same regardless. They may have to physically or manually load or unload, or not load or unload. They might pick and pack, but they might also manually move some materials and get off the forklift to do that. But essentially, they drive the forklift to transport materials. They may manually handle things. They obviously ensure that the load is secure as part of that. They perform daily inspection or equipment checks or equipment inspections in order to make sure that they can do their job safely. So when you look at those sort of basic job tasks, you could probably apply some pretty simple percentages to it. If you truly have someone who is a forklift operator, they probably spend, I'm going to say conservatively, 70%, upwards of 80 to 90% of their day on the forklift. right? That there are definitely people at your work site that are going to spend a really good chunk of their day on the forklift doing exactly that, transporting materials all over the workplace. So the seated position is going to be a key component for them. If they don't have the opportunity to have task variety or the ability to change their position or their posture, they don't have the ability to get on and off the forklift because the nature of work that they do requires them to be on that for extended durations with intermittent breaks, which is fine, but you're still talking about a good chunk of your workday consecutively in the forklift. You don't have a lot of flexibility there to do some job or task rotation. So in those cases, the seated position is going to be an incredibly important prevention strategy, right? That if we can make sure that they are seated in the proper position, that's going to allow us to reduce as much of the injury risk as we possibly can here, right? So that's, when you look at those job tasks, the vast majority of people who operate a forklift, 60, 70, 80% of their day on the forklift, they might manually handle as a small percentage of their day, and they're going to obviously do an equipment check at the beginning of the day. It's a very short period of time. So very clearly the job description really is mostly sitting in the forklift operating controls. And so let's talk about what the hazards they are going to experience. I'm actually going to ask you that question. So these are the key hazards that we would say are ergonomic hazards in general. We would say awkward postures, static postures, or just postures you hold, forceful movements, repetition, vibration, working in a cold or a hot environment, contact stress, and challenges with work organization or work methods are your main ergonomic hazards. If you can just quickly type in the chat bar, what do you think are the key hazards associated with, out of these anyways, are associated with the forklift operator? Awesome. So I've got a couple there. First one here is saying, yeah, I think it makes sense, right? Vibration is a key component that forklift operators sit on a piece of equipment, that any kind of a vehicle that you drive, whether it be a car or anything else, vibration is going to be a major factor for them. And vibration is amplified when you talk about things like driving over a transition plate, right, from a truck back onto the plant floor. Any of those plates that transition between the vehicle or the truck bed and the floor, that can amplify any vibration because they're going to bounce over that potentially, especially if some are better than others, but they are likely going to bounce over that. If you have any other pits or any damage to your flooring, right, all of those things are going to increase your vibration exposure. So that's certainly a key component, and they're exposed to that vibration for upwards of 60, 70, 80% of their day. So that's really significant, and it obviously is going to have a big impact on it. It makes all the posture components worse, essentially, right? Vibration, especially talking about your back. So one of the other comments up here that I'm seeing is talking about sitting, right? Obviously, sitting, if you think about it, is really not your neutral posture. Your neutral posture is actually standing. So standing upright, feet shoulder width apart, elbows at your sides, your upper arms are vertical. Those are all the kind of key components to true quote unquote neutral. Well, we can't achieve neutral when we're sitting in a forklift, because sitting on its own is really a non-neutral position. So now we've applied a seated position, which impacts our back posture. Your forklift may or may not have any kind of lumbar support. So now our back may be in an awkward posture, our body's in an awkward posture because we're sitting, and now our back may be impacted if we're not getting good support out of our seat of our forklift. And so all of a sudden, I'm in a bad back posture, I'm seated, and I'm exposed to constant up or down vibration, which is directly in the same plane as your spine travels. So you're going to see overall, what you typically would see is that people would experience compression of their spine as the day goes on. All the discs in between all of the vertebrae are ultimately going to compress as the day goes on, and they are going to compromise the back's ability to perform work and to perform strength movements for sure, and just basically increase your risk. So we apply vibration and combine that with several awkward postures, which are increasing the risk or making it more difficult for people to do. So I would say your key, thank you for all your examples. There's a few more in there. I'm just going to sort of highlight them as we go forwards here. So some of our key hazards for forklift operators in particular, vibration is one that we already talked about there, right? The constant whole body vibration, particularly like driving, up and down vibration in the same plane as your spine, is a concern. we're primarily, when we're talking about postures in the for forklift operators, you have a few key ones that are problematic, and I've highlighted those in the next several examples here. The primary one that we see is the twisted posture, right? That this individual is twisted looking, so you've got a back twisting and you've got neck twisting to look over your shoulder while driving backwards. This person doesn't, in this picture, doesn't happen to have a load on their forklift at the time, but that is the most common time that we see someone driving backwards, is so they're carrying a load they can't see around, so therefore they're driving backwards for safety, and that makes sense. But what it does is create this ergonomic risk, because a twisted posture, now twisted with vibration, is not putting you in a very good back posture. So that is of concern, and that's probably one of the postures we see the most frequently when we're looking at the ergonomic hazards with forklifts. You are also going to see some folks in the lateral bend position, which is that side bend. Again, this is primarily a back posture to be concerned about. But interestingly, I mean, there are some basic safety principles associated with a forklift. Somebody would tell me that you're not actually supposed to be in this position. But essentially, I've never seen a forklift operator not be in this position at some time. The safety element is that you're not supposed to exit, any part of your body is not supposed to exit the cab of the forklift. And so that lateral bend is typically minor. I'm not talking about somebody hanging out the side of the cab there, but what they're doing is trying to see where the forks are being positioned underneath the load so that they're picking it up correctly. So most forklift operators do bend to the side as part of the load or unload process, especially the load, to make sure that those forks are being properly positioned. So you could expect to see that posture intermittently. It's not as frequent as the twisting position, but it is definitely a key hazard associated with forklift operation. The last one is the reach, right? Every forklift is designed differently. I'm going to highlight some differences a little bit later in the presentation here today, but every forklift is designed differently, but many of them involve some potentially significant reach distances. The picture I have here, I described neutral posture to you a few minutes ago, right? That neutral posture involves a vertical upper arm, so that if you're to protect your shoulder primarily, your upper arm should be vertical against your side, and that allows you to maintain the most neutral, strong shoulder position. The moment that we reach forwards to reach to something, and in this case potentially to apply, it may be minor, but to apply a force to turn the wheel and or operate the controls that are present on the forklift, we are potentially increasing our shoulder risk. And then you may combine that with our first example of the twist. Often that, you can see the gentleman in the picture I've included there, he's bracing himself as part of the twist with an awkward shoulder position to hold on. And that can actually be helpful from a back perspective to support your posture, but it does potentially add some shoulder positioning here. So those are probably the most common hazards that we see from an ergonomic perspective in a forklift operation. Is primarily back issues, back postures, shoulder postures to operate the steering wheel and the controls, back from the twisting, the lateral bending, neck is part of the sort of trunk and back, or neck and back, I should say. And then obviously the vibration component adds a whole other level. So when we revisit that MSD hazard slide, this is essentially the ones I've bolded are essentially the ones that you're going to see most commonly. You're going to see some awkward postures. Most frequently, they're held statically, so for a period of time. So that's your back twisting, your neck twisting, that's your shoulder positions. Force is less of an issue when you're talking about actually operating the forklift. There may still be force in the material handling if they have to get off and load something manually, but ultimately the actual driving component is really not forceful in particular. Repetition may be a factor, especially when you think about your hand postures to operate the controls, to adjust the forks to raise, lower the load, for example. Vibration is a key component here, and I've added the additional one of cold or hot environment. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone. It doesn't apply to all workplaces or all work locations, but cold and hot environments can add some additional stress to your forklift operators, primarily when you're thinking about cold in particular. Cold has hot has its own problems when we're talking about heat stress and things. Like we're about to go into a 35-degree weather on the weekend. I think if you're in the GTA area, we're looking at sort of in the 30s. Heat is a problem, and we know that. But from an ergonomic perspective, heat is less of an issue. Your body moves better when it's warm, but when it's cold, you tend to tense up, and that tensed position is going to increase the risk of injury associated with the awkward and static postures that you're being exposed to. So cold environments can be problematic, and anybody who works in a freezer or who is a shipper receiver, bay doors wide open in the middle of winter to load unload equipment, that's just kind of a normal part of their job. And so they may be exposed to some cold hazards, which would potentially impact their risk by negatively impact it by increasing it. Okay, so ergonomics, we know already, is fitting the work to the worker. So what I want to talk about for the next couple slides here is the idea that how do we do this in a forklift, right? I often say, can you do this the other way around? Can you fit the worker to the work? And the answer is yes, we probably can, but no, we should not, right? That the worker isn't getting any taller or shorter. They're not getting any longer arms tomorrow. They are forever the height and size that they are, granted any unforeseen changes to their body, but ultimately they are the height and size that they are. So what we need to do is make sure that the work, or in this case, the forklift, is adjusted to fit the worker as best as is possible with the equipment that we have. So when we look at that, we're really primarily looking at what ergonomic or adjustment features does your equipment have. Typically in a forklift, a forklift is not the same as a vehicle, right? A vehicle often has 6 or 7 different kinds of adjustments. You can pump up the seat, you can decrease the seat, you can change the seat angle, slide it forwards and backwards, change the backrest angle, you get all kinds of options. In a forklift, we tend to be a little bit more limited in what our movements are. Most typically, we see a seat slide, so they have that fore and aft adjustment. They can move the seat, basically get closer to the pedals or further away. They can adjust the backrest angle, although this will be limited by the back of the forklift. And some forklifts actually have a very small backrest angle adjustment because they basically sit on the back window, especially if the person is tall. They've pushed their chair all the way back. They really sit, say, 8 inches from the window, and so by the time they backrest angle, they can't lean back very far before their seat is basically touching the back of the cab. So backrest angle is typically an adjustment option, although depending on how tall you are, sometimes this is a bit limited. On occasion, we see lumbar support depth, so that they have the flexibility to increase or decrease the lumbar push that's present in their chair. Primarily, those are the key features that we see in a vehicle, or in a forklift, excuse me. The other one that you sometimes get, and again, it depends on the usage and type of work. I was just in the facility I was at most recently doing this training, does some pretty heavy manual work, and their forklifts are pretty heavy duty. They're meant to be lifting very significant loads, and so they also have a like a suspension seat. So it's spring loaded, so they can adjust the tension so that they don't, if they hit a bump, which is very common in the workplace they're in, they wouldn't bottom out or hit their head on the ceiling, right? That the spring loaded seat can be adjusted. So that would be an additional feature that you might see, depending, it might come standard depending on the type of trucks that you're looking at. So those are the most common seat adjustments, and they all sort of have some specifics in terms of what we would want them to be adjusted like, and we'll talk briefly about that in a minute here. Other adjustable features of a forklift primarily are your steering wheel. I mean, really, there's not much else that adjusts here besides mirrors and other things, but primarily your steering wheel adjustments and your seat. And your steering wheel in most forklifts only does 1, maybe 2 things. Like your vehicle may do more than this, but typically your steering wheel in your forklift only does an angle or a tilt adjustment. It'll tilt down towards the operator's legs essentially, or up and away, and it might telescope towards them, again, depending on the piece of equipment that they're working on. So some of the challenges, well, you could probably tell me this, but some of the challenges associated with the steering wheel tilt is that there are some ergonomic benefits to putting the steering wheel or bringing it closer to your body, which essentially is putting it down. But the major drawback to this for a lot of forklift operators is that it makes it much more difficult to enter and exit the vehicle in that position. So what they end up doing is often just leaving the steering wheel at the top position, although that might not be ergonomically beneficial because they have to hop it in and out of this, not that they should ever hop, that's a bad word to use, but they have to enter and exit the forklift so frequently that lowering this down every time to the right quote unquote ergonomic position is inconvenient. And so what you get in the end is forklifts that adjust, the steering wheel angle adjusts, but oftentimes you will see operators with the steering wheel always at the top level. It's never been lowered because it's just a pain in the butt to get in and out of the vehicle that way. So that is sort of the most common features you see and one of the common pitfalls that I find when I'm doing some training with this group. So let's talk a little bit about what this training might look like, because I think there's really two opportunities, like I mentioned before. We're talking about training and we're talking about purchasing. So let's we're going to explore the training part first, because I think this is the low-hanging fruit. This is the one that's easy for you to tackle quickly, right, to try and address the ergonomics in a very fast and efficient way with your group. The purchasing end is fabulous, and we're going to talk about what you can be looking for, but you're probably not buying a whole fleet of new forklifts tomorrow, so you're not making that change immediately. Whereas training and improving their work methods can ultimately start having some significant benefits and happen very quickly. Right, so the goal of forklift training primarily should be to teach workers how to identify the hazards in forklift operation, or tell them what they are. You don't necessarily have to ask them a whole bunch of questions, but you need to make sure they understand what the hazards are and primarily how that impacts their risk. Right? What is the issue with having your steering wheel at the top end if you shouldn't, right? If that's not the right position for you. What is the issue with having your seat all the way to the back if that's not the right position for you because you're perhaps a little bit shorter, right? Those are the kinds of things you want to be talking about with this group so they understand why you want them in the position that you're gonna ultimately put them in before you're done with your training. And then you want to give them the practical strategies, which is about the adjustments on site. So we've been delivering this training in a couple different ways, but sort of most recently, I would say our best practices training and the ones we're getting the best feedback on from the staff and from our client, sort of from the management perspective, and the staff is getting the most engagement with, is actually doing this right on the floor. I don't have a PowerPoint, I don't have a presentation, I'm standing on the floor beside a forklift or two, and we are talking through the hazards or the issues. So we've skipped through, we're not doing any classroom sessions. You know, I would say that this session is about 30 minutes long. Typically, it includes me talking for a few minutes, like 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 on the outside, but that gives us an opportunity to sort of go through the basics of what we're looking for. And when I'm talking, sometimes I'm literally sitting in the forklift and talking to the group on the ground so I can demonstrate some of the things that I'm talking about, right? It's very rarely a classroom session. This group isn't good at classroom. They don't do that every day. They sit on a forklift, they operate a piece of equipment, they're out in the production area or in your warehouse. They are not people who get a lot of benefit and engage really well in a classroom type setting. They are way more intrigued of putting their hands on a piece of equipment and actually seeing how what you're talking about applies to them, right? So we've been doing this literally on the side of the forklift, talking through some of these examples. You could do it in small groups. We do add a one-on-one component. We've been doing this where like I said, I do a 5 to 10 minute discussion and examples and demonstration. And then the last group I did, we started getting in the forklift after that. So it sort of transitioned from that basic education session and demonstration, jumping into some one-on-one time. So every one of the operators there was about 10 of them, I think, 12 maybe, and every one of them jumped in the forklift and we adjusted the seat to fit them in that moment, right? So A, we practiced safe entry and exit, and then B, we got them all adjusted properly in the seat and made sure that they understood why those adjustment features were the right fit for them. And if anybody had questions or said, oh, but I really prefer it this way, it gave us a chance to really talk to them about that one-on-one, about why that wasn't perhaps the best position for them. And we could talk about, like one of the guys said, well, sometimes I drive for 2 or 3 hours, but sometimes I drive for 2 or 3 minutes and then I hop out. And so we talked about, for example, the steering wheel example I talked about earlier, the angle adjustment. We talked about that. When you know your when you know you're only going to be on the forklift for a couple minutes, okay, that's not the time to adjust the steering wheel. That's when it gets annoying and frustrating and is in the way. But when you're going to know you're going to be on the forklift because you've got a big work order and you're going to be doing a lot of picking, right? You're going to look at this and go, I'm going to be on the forklift for an hour to fill this order. And so that's the time to make those full adjustments and make sure your steering wheel is down and low. And it gave us that opportunity to have that one-on-one discussion, which was a really great opportunity for him to ask questions that he probably wouldn't have and didn't anyways, and probably wouldn't have asked in the large group discussion component. So it's a nice way to sort of tackle this in a more concrete way for these guys so that they actually see what it is that you're talking about, right, and can better understand. So the key parts to the training that I would recommend that you're looking at are education about safe entry and exit. If I had to guess that this is still one of your major areas of concern with forklift operators, historically they might enter the equipment properly, facing forwards like this gentleman in my picture is with 3 points of contact, but it's much less common for that to be the case on the exit from the vehicle. They're way more likely to walk off than they are to turn around and come down, maintaining 3 points of contact at all times. So we practice safe entry and exit. We demonstrate the differences and what that looks like, and talk to them about why that's super important. In particular, this would be really relevant if the site I was at most recently, they spent a lot of time doing outside work. They actually make lumber, and so they have big loads and pallets of lumber, and so they pick from outside. A lot of their loads are stored outside, and so one of their comments and their discussion points is that they actually exit the forklift differently in the winter than they do in the summer. 2 or 3 different guys said the same thing. They said, you know what, I do it differently when it's snowy out than I do when it's sunny and hot, because when it's snowy, it's been slippery in the past. Like if you're out in the ice and the snow, it can be really slippery on some of those steps. And so I always turn around and back out. And it's a good discussion point about if you do that for safety in the winter, then that is the safe way always, right? That is the way that we should go on a regular basis. So it gave us a nice opportunity to start opening the lines of communication about why exiting this way is also the most appropriate approach. So this is a great time to revisit that. You can talk about the ergonomics of it. You can talk about the handhold positions, 3 points of contact, all the key components, but certainly want to be addressing entry and exit, because I would guess that's still one of your potentially regular concerns or issues when it comes to MSDs with this group. The next thing you're going to do is spend time talking to them about their seat and, well, basically any vehicle adjustments. So you want to talk about seat adjustments, steering wheel adjustments, and equipment adjustments. So because the forklift doesn't have a lot of adjustability, it doesn't have 15 different levers to pull and push, you're talking about 2 or 3 different options. This is a good opportunity to walk through the basics of what you're looking for. And it is pretty straightforward. What we're looking for in terms of seat depth, right? How the seat slide part, how forwards or backwards you are. You're going to position it so that you have a slightly bent knee, right? So your knee isn't straight out in front of you, and you don't want to be crammed up as much as is possible on a forklift. You don't want to be crammed up against the steering wheel. So you want a slightly bent knee. You want to be easily able to reach the pedals. So you adjust the slide in order to achieve that position. In terms of backrest angle, you want to adjust it so that you are upright but slightly off center. So just more like a computer workstation used to be recommend you sit up 90 degrees. That's not actually the ideal position. You want to be leaning back 10 or 15 degrees off of square. That's pretty common for a driving position in your regular vehicle. It also applies to the driving position here in the forklift. So just off of center would be the ideal. And that's really the 2 key components. If you have any kind of suspension built into your seat, then you're going to adjust that, obviously, so you don't hit the ceiling or bottom out. But those are probably your 2 primary areas. If there is a lumbar support adjustment, make sure people know. You'd be surprised how many people have no idea that a feature like a lumbar adjustment is available in their equipment. So if you do have that, you want to make sure that you're sharing that information and talking about the importance of it and what it does for the staff. So those are sort of the 3 key adjustments. Like I said, it's pretty straightforward in terms of your adjustability options. Soft knee, you want to be backrest just slightly off of center. There's funny things that you can see when you start to do this. For example, I did this two or three times in the last few months. And so the first time, I think, when we borrowed somebody's forklift, pulled it up, and everybody was trying to get in it, and they were like, oh, I can't, this doesn't adjust as much as mine. And we started looking. The reason was because this person is a little bit shorter and had a whole bunch of manuals and other things just stuck behind the seat. And so when all that stuff was in there, of course the seat doesn't slide backwards very far because it has no room to go. So we had to empty all of that stuff out to make sure. But those are things that happen regularly, that you'll find there's all kinds of stuff stashed back there, which it may be limiting seat adjustability. So those are the kinds of things you can be talking about as part of this kind of a training. Okay, adjustment for steering wheel. Like I said earlier, you want the steering wheel, the closer the steering wheel is to your body, the less reaching you have to do. That's the very basic way to approach this. So you don't want it resting on your legs, and you don't want your knees to bump against the column, right, that comes out from the equipment to the steering wheel. But you do want a little bit of clearance there, but the closer you can get the steering wheel in a comfortable position, the better it is for a reach perspective. You're going to reach less if it's closer to your body. So that's what we're essentially looking for here in your steering wheel options. And if it adjusts for angle or if it telescopes, those are both two features you're going to use to try and achieve that. Right? And that's essentially the basics of steering wheel adjustment. There's often, I haven't run into a forklift in maybe ever that has more than those two options. So you're really talking about 4 or 5 different key adjustment features. Figure out what your trucks do and then educate on those pieces of equipment and to make it simple and make sure that the staff understand the importance of those adjustments. Why do they exist, right? It's important that they use them to fit their body as best as possible, because that's how they protect themselves from injury. Obviously, as with every vehicle, if you have mirrors built in for reversing, every operator should be adjusting those regularly, and they likely are for sight lines, which is important, obviously, but also for the postural perspective. If your mirrors are adjusted properly, you can do some things without doing a full twist to look over your shoulder, for example. So you're going to minimize the time you spend in that awkward posture because your mirrors can help you see that full position, or you may not have to twist as much because you can see a different angle or a different area that you couldn't without the mirror. So certainly adjusting those regularly to make sure they fit you properly. Important to remember, you may also need to adjust them throughout the day. So operators hop in at the beginning of the day. If they're on the forklift for a couple hours straight, for example, you may find that your body has changed, right? You've literally gotten shorter in the time that you've been on the forklift because of that constant vibration. So adjusting those mirrors to make sure they fit you and still are showing all the areas that you want to see, getting you the full picture of what's happening behind you can be important strategy. So those are sort of the key components: safe entry and exit, and then adjustments of the equipment, seat, steering wheel, and mirrors. There are some other things that we do also typically train on, again, depending on the work site and what they do, but we might be looking or talking a little bit about the idea of lifting after driving. So you've been in the forklift for the last hour and a half, you're hopping out and you have a manual handling task to do. So let's say you've been picking full skids for a while, but now you only need a part skid. So you have to manually handle 10 or 12 boxes to basically down pack. And so in that case, you're now manually handling. There's been lots of research that's been done in this environment over quite a few years now, but the idea of sitting and being exposed to vibration and then getting off and immediately doing some kind of manual handling task like lifting or pushing and pulling, particularly when those things that you're lifting or moving are fairly heavy, is problematic. That's where one of our biggest injury risks is that we shouldn't be just getting off and immediately doing some very manual physical work, right? That ultimately we want to be teaching them talking about the basics of safe lifting, but perhaps just as importantly, we want to talk about the organization of work that allows for a break before they do that lift. So if they've been on the forklift for 5 minutes, we're not worried because the vibration impact here is minimal. They haven't been on long enough to experience the compression of the spine that we'd be talking about. But if they've been on the forklift for an hour or more, they may be starting to experience some of that creep that we talk about with driving. And so when they hop off and then all of a sudden they're lifting, that is going to has a potential to be a major risk factor for spinal injury, so for back injury. So in that case, we want to talk about organizing the work just to give ourselves a little bit of time. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of time. A minute or two is totally appropriate, but that's the time to go and get your next work order. That's the time to take a quick bathroom break if you need to do that, right? That 2 minutes that you take after you get off the forklift before you do any significant manual handling is a really good way to prevent a potential injury. So being thoughtful about how that works and talking about the way your work is organized. It's not always practical to take a big long break, not that you need a big one, but to take even a short break sometimes feels impractical. But if you can work with them on some strategies that you would recommend in order to address that, that would be ideal. So saying, you know, you do have the time, let's take a look at what that might be. So, you know, I think when you get off the forklift, you know, this is the time that I want you to do this, 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 and then you're going to go do the manual picking of whatever it is that you have to lift, right? Sort of creating that structure that says, this is how we want you to organize your work so that you get a 1 or 2 minute break before you do any lifting. Because oftentimes the work can be varied enough that they have that flexibility to do it. They just don't necessarily see or understand how it all fits into their system, right? And into them getting their work done for the day. Any questions about the training components, about some suggestions, any thoughts on anything you've done with forklift training that maybe I have skipped over something that you wanted me to address? I'm not seeing anything pop in, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a quick email or a message in the question or a message in the chat bar. I'm happy to answer any as we go along here. So the last part I want to talk about today, sorry, my words stretched off the page there a little bit, but the last thing I want to talk to you about today is the idea of purchasing opportunities. That I know that this is a long-term fix, right? But it is a fix that should be in place. The ideal is that you are designing out some of the issues associated with forklift work, right? We know the hazards that exist. We know that twisting is problematic. We know that reaching to the controls is problematic. We know that vibration is problematic. So those are opportunities for us to start addressing these hazards in an engineering control way, right? Not just teaching people how to, yes, I've been talking about training, and that's the short-term solution, right? That's the low-hanging fruit. Let's deal with it first. But we can also teach, give people tools to be able to do it better. So this is where training is your work method opportunity. That's your administrative change. Changing your equipment, right? The purchasing standard that, when you go to buy a new forklift is to consider more of the ergonomic features. That this sometimes is an area our clients don't do a great job on, and there is some significant opportunity here. Now, I realize I'm going to give you some very general examples in the next few slides, and I realize that not all of these will apply to every workplace. There are some times that some of the examples I'm going to give you will not make sense for the type of work that you do or the type of forklift that you need, and that's fine. Realize I had to be general here today, but I just want to give you some examples of the kind of stuff that's out there that you could make choices on or expect as part of your purchasing standard as you move forwards with buying any new pieces of forklifts or renting or anything, right? So specifically, one of the newest, I don't think it's actually that new anymore, but it's not something we see very often, and it does exist, is the idea of a swivel seat. And again, this doesn't necessarily, the price tag to add this is probably more significant than you would think, but essentially what we're talking about here is going to be for folks who spend a lot of time driving backwards. They're going to be the good ones that would really benefit from this. If you drive forwards for most of your time on the forklift, this isn't a great fit. It's not going to give you a significant reduction in postural issues. But if you drive backwards for a good chunk of your forklift time, then a seat that swivels partly, right? This one, the example I pulled here, has a 17-degree range of swivel. It's going to reduce how far you have to twist, right? That's the very basics of a swivel seat, is that it does some of the twisting for you. So instead of you facing forwards and doing a full twist to look over your shoulder, you're now facing, in this example, 15, 16, or 17 degrees to the side, and you're able to look over your shoulder still with a much lesser degree of twist to your back. So that can be something to consider depending on the type of work that you do. There are also often a lot of upgrades available for different seats. So there's a basic forklift seat that does essentially what I showed you earlier, right? Slides forwards and backwards, and the backrest angle can be adjusted, but doesn't do a whole lot else, right? But you can start to make upgrades typically to the seat that you're putting into your forklifts when you're purchasing. So things like full seat suspension. If vibration is a major concern for your workplace, then full seat suspension would be a great option to consider. Extra shock absorption would be a good option to consider if you have the flexibility to choose that it has an adjustable lumbar support, either whether that be in height adjustment or in even depth adjustment. Any flexibility in your lumbar region will get you into a better position, better back position, which will ultimately protect your back more throughout the workday and should prevent some of the discomfort and injuries you're likely experiencing with your forklift. So there are always seat upgrades available. I shouldn't say always, but virtually always seat upgrades available, and it's worthwhile exploring and better understanding the ergonomic implications of those upgrades. Because if you're having a lot of back injuries, then seat upgrades might be the one that prevents it. So spending an extra, I'm just going to pull numbers out of the air because I do not know what these cost, but spending an extra $1,000 a forklift or $500 a forklift to do an upgrade may seem like a lot of money at the time. But if you prevent one injury, you have paid back the upgraded seat in no time, and your staff will likely love it, which is another big benefit of this, is the morale booster that goes along with some fancy new seats is also a big benefit here too, potentially. So those are just things to consider. They're your biggest engineering opportunities in general. Other things that are sort of, one thing that's a retrofit that I've never actually seen in a workplace, although I know it exists out there, are seat cushions that are meant to absorb some of the vibration. So this might be as an accommodation tool in particular. I'm not saying go retrofit all your, or go buy a piece of this cushion for all of your forklifts, but if you have somebody who's particularly struggling with a back injury, for example, and vibration is a factor for them, then an anti-vibration seat cushion might be something that you should be interested in trying, just to see if it does reduce some of their exposure and ultimately allows them to continue doing being a forklift operator or doing it for a longer period of time per day, for example. Other things to consider are cab space. This is not something you always get a lot of flexibility in, but and sometimes it's dictated by the type of forklift that you need. But again, using the example I just saw last week, a couple of the guys that we tried to fit into the forklift that we had, which was their standard model, it was tight. And so long legs doesn't always fit very well into a piece of equipment like this. So be mindful of that when you're choosing equipment. Sometimes you're limited by the type of space that you have. You need a small cab because you need a small piece of equipment to get around tight corners and into tight spaces, and that's fine. But if you have some flexibility here, investigating how you get some cab space, just to allow people to be able to adjust the seat to actually fit them. If the cab is too small, they're not going to end up in the right ergonomic position. They're going to be more folded up than I would like them to be, which does potentially increase their injury risk. So it's definitely worthwhile exploring. Not that you need to have the Cadillac of cab spaces here, but be mindful of how many people are going to fit in there. Think about your biggest or tallest males and be mindful about whether they would fit right in that. That's probably a pretty good reference. There's also the debate about a sit-down versus stand-up forklifts, and again, I realize that stand-up forklifts are not logical for some workplaces. You can't always use these interchangeably, but they do have some very significant ergonomic differences. Typically, stand-up trucks lead to increased visibility. There's less obstacles in the way, which is always nice. There's also a lot more mobility options for people who drive a stand-up truck, so they are able to turn their feet a little bit in order to change their body position to reduce the amount of twist. They already typically stand sideways in that truck, so there's less twist. They might be more twisting of the neck, but much less twisting of the back, because they basically stand and are sort of halfway in between the posture of driving one way and the other. So it actually tends to have a pretty significant positive impact on awkward postures. So that's something to consider if that's an option for you. And typically reaching is also reduced in a stand-up truck. So those are things that you can, just food for thought. If it doesn't apply to your workplace, if stand-ups are not an option for you, then that's fine. But if they are, there are some ergonomic advantages potentially. So it's worth exploring that a little bit more to make sure that you really understand what ultimately is part of the purchasing component, right? You want to make sure we understand which model do we really need in order to address the ergonomic hazards we're seeing. So quick time for review here is just sort of highlighting the key components we've talked about today, is that purchasing is your best prevention strategy. As with everything in our world, anything health and safety, engineering controls, designing out the issues is always the goal, and purchasing is your opportunity to do that. You can also retrofit. In some cases, you can for example, you're having some challenges with the seat of your forklifts. You can often retrofit the seat with an upgraded option or something that is different to address some of the needs you're having. But upgrading in that way, or retrofitting, or looking at different purchasing standards when you're getting a whole new forklift is really your best prevention strategy. Those are your engineering controls and your biggest opportunities here. And then your administrative control is the training part. And they really should go hand in hand as well. So if you get new forklifts or new piece of equipment, you should be doing training on how to properly adjust that equipment. There's a reason you bought that stuff, right? You spend the money to get a slightly upgraded model, which is fabulous, but if you don't train them how to use it, then they're likely still using it poorly, and you haven't actually addressed your injury issues in the first place because you didn't teach them how to use it properly. And so making sure that those things do get paired together is really the ideal. I would strongly encourage you, if you're going to do some training, to consider an interactive delivery style. Get out there, talk about forklifts with the staff on a forklift, right? Put them in there, look at their layout, their setup, give them an opportunity to ask those questions in a more intimate environment. That one-on-one style, you'll find you get a lot more requests and questions. They're cautious about doing that in a bigger group, but once you get them in the forklift, I find they're much more open to actually asking some clarifying questions. And as part of that, take this opportunity to train on your safe entry and exit, not just adjustments of the equipment, but how do you get in and out safely, and what does that look like? Okay, and in particular, actually, again, the example from the other week is that they technically have they have access to the forklift on both sides. There's actually a door on both sides of the forklift, but only one side of the forklift has the grab bars. Only one side is actually really meant as their entry and exit for primary entry and exit. And so it was one of the conversation points that you should always get in on the left side of the forklift as if you're getting in the driver's side door, because that's where the grab bars are. That's where the safety requirements are. So those are the kinds of things that you can be talking about with them. If anybody has any questions, now would be the time to start chatting. So start sending me a message in the question section or the chat bar. Either one is fine. Just because I am just about to wrap up. Today, as my last thing, I wanted to make a special offer to everyone that's attended. If you are interested in having us do any forklift training, ergonomic forklift training with your staff, we are happy to help you out with that. We'd ask some basic questions about what kinds of adjustment features you have, maybe get some pictures, but we can talk about what that would look like, how we're doing it, giving you some good descriptions today about how that's engaging. And we're working with our frontline staff to make sure that they actually understand the implications of ergonomics. But if you are interested in booking a 30-minute ergonomic training session with us, we will happily give you a second one on the same day at no additional cost. So we'll give you 2 sessions for the price of one, and ultimately to help you address maybe 2 different working groups, or perhaps you have a big group in a warehouse environment. You want to break it down into a couple smaller groups to be more intimate and give them a chance to ask more questions. We'll do 2 sessions for the price of one if you're interested in having any forklift training done. So Julie, our admin assistant, is with us today on the computer, and she will send out an email right after this webinar, and it'll be real simple. If you're interested in taking advantage of this offer, you just reply to her email, and that's it. We'll reach out and contact you to talk about what that looks like and get you some pricing, and the only caveat is that the sessions need to be booked before August 30th. So before the summer is out is when we need those sessions booked by in order to take advantage of this offer. So hopefully that was helpful today. I'm still just waiting to see if there's any questions coming in. I'll give you another minute or so. Okay, I've got one question that says, in a very busy environment where operators are required to begin lifting as soon as they get off the forklift, how do you address this concern? Good question, and the answer is well, the answer is multifold, but ideally the answer is that we make sure they do, I mean, if they have to lift as soon as they get off the forklift, then we're going to be doing safe lifting training with them, that they need to make sure that if they are going to be required to lift immediately after, that is when safe lifting methods are going to be imperative, right? That's safe lifting is how we protect our back in the lifting process. So if we don't employ those practices when we're already at greater risk because we just got off a piece of equipment, we're going to be potentially in trouble in that moment. So spending more time with them so that they better understand the importance of safe lifting, especially after they get off a piece of equipment, is definitely ideal. And beyond that, if they have to lift as soon as they get off a forklift, you can't provide any kind of break, then you might even consider different work methods. Duration of exposure, do they have to be on the forklift for an hour and a half before they get off? If you can break their jobs down into shorter increments so they're only driving for 20 or 30 minutes before they're getting off to do that lift, that is going to reduce the creep component that's being applied to your spine. So those are sort of a couple quick but not necessarily easy ways to start thinking about that. Great question. Okay, I don't have any other ones coming in. I'll be here for another minute or two to happily answer questions for you. Other part of this that I should have said earlier is that we had not until very recently, but we now have all of our webinars up for the rest of the year on our website. So if you are looking to attend a few more webinars with us, if you enjoyed this one or one of our previous ones, please join us for another one in the future. They're all listed on our website now, and you can get registered at any time for the rest of the year's webinars. Thank you so much, everybody, for your day, for your time today, and I look forward to connecting with you. Just make sure you reply to Julie's email here in a few minutes to make sure you get your 30-minute ergonomic trainings booked with us before August 30th to take advantage of that great offer. Have a great weekend, everyone.